All right, welcome back to Mr. Barry Lectures. This is Chapter 11, Section 4, British Imperialism in India. This is how I spend my Saturdays, kids. You're welcome. Okay, so as the Mughal Empire is declining, Britain is going to seize Indian territory, and soon it is going to control most all of the Indian subcontinent. Let's begin. British interest in India began in sort of an odd way. Well, not an odd way, just differently than a lot of countries take over another country. Most countries will take over a country by military means. Britain happened to take over India basically by sending a company there and letting them do whatever they want. Britain had been in India as early as the 1600s for trading purposes, and one of the companies that they'd sent there was the British East India Company. And the British East India Company, probably most people are familiar with as a trader of tea. Indeed, during the American Revolution, the British East India Company had the boats that had their tea thrown into Boston Harbor during the Boston Tea Party. A lot of you are also probably familiar with the British East India Company because of Pirates of the Caribbean. Got a lot of people that responded that the other day. Now, at the time of the 1600s, the Mughal dynasty was generally able to keep European traders in check. They had them under control. And by 1707, the empire was falling apart. They could no longer control European economic interests, and by 1757 the British East India Company had defeated Indian forces. Now keep in mind that term, that the company had defeated Indian forces. This implies something very interesting, and that is that the company actually has its own army, which we'll mention in a moment. This photograph is a bit hard to see, but all these military members here have the logo of the British East India Company on their forehead. And anyway, so the British East India Company becomes the leading force in India through about the mid-1800s. Now let's talk about British East India's control over India for a little bit. The British East India Company rules India through the 1800s, or the early 1800s anyway, about halfway, with very little interference from the British government. I mean, officially, the British government regulated the East India Company's efforts in both London and in India, but until the beginning of the 19th century, the company really did not have a lot of interference from the British government. The company, it should be mentioned, also had its own army, and this army was led by British officers, and it was staffed by what are called sepoys, or Indian soldiers. The governor of Bombay, Mountstuart Elphinstone, referred to the sepoy army as a delicate and dangerous machine, which, with as little management as may easily turn against us. So a lot of Europeans and English people were actually very concerned that this was an army that could easily turn against them, that could become a problem. Sepoy, by the way, is one of your vocab words, and it is an Indian soldier who is serving under British command. You can see several of them right here, a Muslim, a Hindu, and a Sikh kind of sepoy. Okay. The Sikh, by the one, is the one with the turban. I'm not sure exactly which one of the other two is Hindu and or Muslim. At least that is my impression of the photo here. All right. Britain's jewel in the crown. India was easily considered Britain's most valuable colony. They made a great deal of money on them. And India thusly earned a nickname as Britain's brightest, quote, jewel in the crown, unquote. This is, again, because they are so valuable. Under British control, Indians are actually forced to produce raw materials for British manufacturing, and are also forced to buy British goods. They made things like cotton and sent them to Britain. Britain would take this cotton, refine it into a textile good, and send it back to India, and then make Indian people actually buy these textile goods. Jewel in the crown, by the way, one of your vocab words there in green. The British colony of India was given this nickname due to its importance to the empire, both as a supplier of raw materials, as in cotton, and as a market for British goods, as in the textiles that they would send back. So there you go. But India was really truly the most important colony of Britain, especially after the loss of the American colonies, which quite frankly, were responsible for. So there you go. Britain is also going to take a great interest in transporting goods in India. Britain is going to establish an extensive railroad network in India, and this makes the transport of goods and raw materials much more efficient. Most of these raw materials that were being transported were going to be agricultural crops, things that were produced on plantations like tea, indigo for dyeing fabrics, cotton for making of the fabrics, as well as things like opium. Opium you may be familiar with, possibly, because it is actually the agricultural base for things like heroin, oxycodone, hydrocodone, painkillers of that kind. Opiates in general. Opium, by the way, we should mention is actually important, and so is cotton and various other things that were being produced in India, because historic events were going to affect the production of all of these things. For example, opium was sold to China for tea. There is actually a whole series of opium-related historical events that occur in China, which we'll go into in a post section, which we'll pull from chapter 12. We're not going to go through that whole chapter, but we will talk about that. Cotton production is also going to increase in India during certain portions of time, especially during the 1860s, because of the U.S. Civil War. Now, the South was cut off from the North and couldn't, in fact, export its goods to market. And so India actually has to take up the slack that the American South is no longer able to export to produce and to supply for Britain's textile industry. So again, India is very important to Britain economically. Just to give you an idea of the extent of the railway network that is going on in India, here is a map from 1909, and it's the general map of the railways in India. There are thousands upon thousands of miles of track in India that were established by the English, the British. A lot of these tracks are still in use on some level or another. And India does have a very vibrant railroad network still today. It is used as one of the primary ways to transport goods and services as well as people and to travel across the country. It is an incredibly inexpensive way to travel, actually, so many people still use the railroad networks, unlike a lot of other places in the world today. Now, let us talk about the impacts of colonialism in India. First, let's start with the negatives, and then we'll go on to the positives. British people held most of the political and economic power in India. That is, they did not allow Indians to, choose their leaders. They didn't allow them necessarily have all the businesses that they wanted. And to this point, Indian-owned industries were actually restricted. They were restricted, and they were actually required to, in a lot of cases, in the case of farming especially, to focus on cash crops, which made a lot of money for Europe and for Britain, but it also made a lot of Indians lose self-sufficiency. So when you're required to make things like cotton, things like opium, things like indigo, these are things you cannot eat. You can't feed yourself, and so you're losing the ability to provide for yourself. You have to actually go into the market and buy food to live on. Okay, so you can't necessarily provide for yourself. You can make enough money to take care of yourself, but you can't just be left alone to your own devices. You actually have to rely on the rest of the world to take care of you. We should mention also that cash crop production caused a lot of famines in India during the late 1800s due to lack of edible crops. Again, you're focusing on stuff like cotton, like indigo, like opium, things that in general you can't eat. I mean, you can eat opium, but you won't gain a lot of nutrition from it. But because you don't have a lot of edible crops, people die because they can't, feed themselves, really. So that was a great negative during this period. Now, though the British did not require Indians to assimilate, missionaries and the racist attitudes of most British officials did threaten traditional Indian culture. When you try to change someone's religion, or you make out that whatever they are just inherently is bad, a lot of these things break down Indian culture, and that is an unfortunate consequence of British colonialism as well. Impacts of colonialism. On the positive side, there are some good things that the British did in India. Britain laid down, obviously, the most extensive railroad network in the world in India to that point. It was, again, thousands upon thousands of miles of railroad. These railroads enabled the development of India's economy, could ship goods and services much more easily and quickly than you could ever before. And it also connected a lot of communities. So if you lived on one side of India and you had family on the other side and you, for some reason, wanted to visit them, say on a summer trip or something, you could do that now rather than before, where you would have to spend an exorbitant amount of money moving, horses or donkeys or that kind of thing across the country over a long period of time. You could actually just take a train and get there fairly quickly. Modern roads, again, improved the transportation network of India. Things like telephones and telegraph lines were set up, so communication was much better. Dams were put in for the production of electricity and or the saving of communities, depending on how you look at it. Bridges were put in, again, improving the transportation network, and things like electricity were also brought in, which you can do all manner of things with electricity. Actually kickstarts a lot of the industrialization in India. All these things were brought in by the British. Now, would they probably have gotten there without the British? Yes, but would they have more than probably been greatly behind if they hadn't? Absolutely. Things like schools and hospitals are also established in India, so education improves and health standards improve, so that's a positive. And British troops, that is the Army of England being there, also made India a safer place to live. And two of the ways that it made India a safer place to live is by clearing central India of bandits. There were a lot of people in central India that if you were traveling through there would either beat you up and take your money or your goods, might kill you on your travels. And so the army actually came in and put a lot of these people in jail, executed a lot of them, got them out of central India, so that traveling and living in central India was actually much safer. They also ended a lot of localized wars and prevented local rulers from fighting each other. So that was a good thing too. Again, making life safer for Indians living in and around these areas. Now, discontent is going to grow in India while England is there. There are a lot of people, as in other places in the world, who are unhappy about Britain controlling most of India. Britain controlled most of India by about the 1850s, so, like I said, there are an extensive amount of people who are pretty unhappy about this. Also, many Indians believe that British were there attempting to convert them to Christianity. Obviously, you mess with somebody's religion, they generally aren't very happy or pleased about that. They also resented a lot of the constant racism that was expressed towards them. British people generally looked at Indians as second-class citizens or worse, as would occur with other races, of course, Africans, etc. Europeans generally didn't look at them as being equal. They looked at them as being an inferior race. So Indians did not really appreciate this. So some discontent is going to grow there. One particular example of rebellion that occurs in India is called the Sepoy Mutiny. And in 1857, rumors spread amongst the Sepoy army in India. These, again, are these Indian soldiers that are fighting under the command of British officers, that the cartridges for their new rifles, they're using something called the Enfield rifle, they've been issued, are greased with pork and beef fats. Now, just to give you a little lesson on ballistics, what's happening here is they're making these things called paper cartridges. You lay out a piece of paper, you put the powder charge on there, you put the lead ball round on there, and you roll it up and twist the ends so that you have a pre-packaged charge of powder and projectile, and in the case of the paper, you have a wad in which to put between the two to pack down the powder. Now, they're greasing this with pork and beef fats, though, that if you're in a moist situation, that the powder's not going to get wet. As we all know, black powder does not work if it's wet. So it's a good little system. The problem with this is that many sepoys would not use these cartridges specifically because of the pork and beef fats. Hindus in particular consider the cow sacred, so using any cow materials, such as the fat of the cow, just generally implies that you have hurt the cow. So that was not cool with the Hindus. That was seen to them as a sin unto their religion. Muslims, similarly, would not use the cartridges because of the pork fats. They see the pig as an unclean animal. If you go into the Quran and even into the Jewish Torah, where they're related religions as much as those two fight now, they both have sections that refer to the pig as an unclean animal. You're not to come into contact with it. You're certainly not to eat it. And part of the problem with these cartridges is the way that you're actually trained to use them is to bite one end off, pour the powder down the end of the gun, throw the ball in there, and pack it down. So the fact that it actually had to come in contact with the mouth was very unnerving for Muslims. And again, they saw this contact with pork and pork products as unclean and as a sin. Therefore, many sepoys would not use these cartridges. A lot of them were jailed, and those that were not jailed caused something called the Sepoy Mutiny. They rose up against the British military, and they caused a lot of fierce fighting in northern India for a couple of years. Sikhs, another part of the military, had no problem with these cartridges, it should be mentioned, and they became, therefore, the main sepoys or soldiers used by Britain. You can usually tell Sikhs because of the turbans that they wear, and you can see them here in this picture. Here, by the way, is your definition for Sepoy Mutiny that you need to use. Sepoy Mutiny was very simply an 1857 rebellion of Hindu and Muslim soldiers, or sepoys, against the British in India. Okay. Now, the Sepoy Mutiny is often seen as a turning point in Indian history because Britain took more direct control of India after the rebellion. The areas under British control were eventually called the Raj, and the Raj actually existed before the Sepoy Mutiny, but became much more extensive after this point. A British governor was going to control parts of India, and they were going to be called the Viceroy of India. This gentleman here to the right was one of the viceroys during the 1800s, named Lord Curzon. He is also sitting next to a Maharaja, or local prince, named Patiala, I believe is his name. So there are areas of India that remained outside the control of the Raj, that still sort of governed locally in an indirect manner from Britain, and they were generally controlled by Indian princes such as this. Raj, I should mention also, is one of your one of your vocab words, and it is the British-controlled portions of India between the years of 1757 and 1947. It is very interesting, actually, that Britain is able to hold on to the colony of India for so long. They actually hold on to it till after the Second World War. Now, there is a lot of nationalism that surfaces during this period of Indian history. There are a lot of calls for reform, and some of these calls for reform are made in the 1800s by people such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy, or Mohun Roy. I'm not sure exactly the pronunciation there. He is going to lead a lot of a modernization movement in India during this period. Ram Mohan Roy was a modern-thinking, well-educated Indian, and he began a campaign to move India away from traditional practices and ideas. He is sometimes called the father of the modern India, and Roy saw arranged child marriages, the rigid caste separation as parts of religious life that needed to be changed. He believed that if the practices were not changed, India would continue to be controlled by outsiders. Roy's writings actually inspired other Indian reformers to call for the adoption of Western ways, and Roy also founded a social reform movement that worked for change in India. Now, nationalism, besides modernization and westernization, nationalist feelings started to surface in India. Now, Indians hated a system that made them second-class citizens in their own country, and they were barred from the top posts in Indian civil service, and those who managed to get middle-level jobs were paid less than Europeans. For example, a British engineer on the East India Railway made nearly 20 times as much money as an Indian engineer. So there was, of course, a lot of discontent and calls for reform during this period. A lot of which had been kind of forwarded by Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Now, nationalist groups are going to also form in India during this period. Because of the growing nationalism, this is going to lead to a founding of two nationalist groups, the Indian National Congress in 1885 and the Muslim League in 1906. At first, such groups are going to concentrate on specific concerns for Indians, but by the early 1900s, they're all calling for self-government. The nationalists were further inflamed in 1905 by the partition of Bengal. The province was too large for administrative purposes, so the British divided it into a Hindu section and a Muslim section. As a result, acts of terrorism broke out, and in 1911, yielding to pressure, the British took back the order and divided the province in a different way. Conflict over the control of India continued to develop between Indians and the British in the following years, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, the same struggles for control and land took place between the local groups and major European powers that dominate them. We're going to see a lot of this in Section 5, so look forward to that, and I'll see you guys next week. Be safe this weekend and have a good time.